Hello. As I had promised to a few people anyway, I'm going to record some lectures for you. Lectures I might give a version of in class if we were having class. I'm also going to be incorporating some of the material from the new textbook that we're now using in what used to be my face-to-face class. The book by Giddens, Denier, Applebaum and Carr, Essentials of Sociology. This may be reversed, mirror image. I think there's a way I can fix that. I probably should. So I'm going to stop this recording. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is the big topic of social class and inequality, social stratification. This is going to lead us into discussions of gender and racial and ethnic inequality as well. It's appropriate to really kind of consider all these things almost one topic, because these dimensions of social stratification, which I will define for you again if you've forgotten what that is, they tend to intersect in reality. The experience of an African American working class individual is different from that of an African American physician, for instance. It's difficult. It's the life experiences, life chances of a gay Latina working class woman is different from that of a gay white professional worker. So we'll get to that when we do. The concept of intersectionality is something I'll bring up. So in any case, inequality in general is what I'm going to be talking about in this and the next several recordings. So some of you may remember we talked about the great chain of being early in the class. And if you're in my online class, you've never heard of this. This was the idea that there was a given order to a ranking of all creatures great and small, including inanimate objects and insects, that had been set up in the beginning by a creator. In the Christian version, of course, that was God. Really, the great chain of being, as far as I know, was may have been limited to I only know it from the Christian tradition, the Middle Ages. There may be equivalents in other religious traditions that I'm unfamiliar with. So this is the example I'll use, and it goes back, as I mentioned, to well before the Middle Ages. It actually, I think, goes back to Greek philosophy in one form or another, but it became formalized and institutionalized in the Middle Ages. There were, the idea was, as I mentioned, that all beings were ranked from high to low. Of course, God was at the highest level, and the rocks and inanimate objects at the lowest. And medieval religious scholars, scholastics, for instance, actually wrote down the rankings in detail so that you could look up in a book to determine who ranked above, who was higher on this chain of being. And this went right into the household. The female spouse, the wife, for instance, ranked lower than the husband, and the youngest male child ranked higher than the oldest female child. So sexism was built into this system. And because people believed that this was implemented by God, ordained by God, that there should be these rankings that were fixed for all time, there was nothing you could really do to change your status. And if you tried it, you were not just rebelling against the social order in which you lived, you were rebelling against God in a sense. In the Middle Ages, that was an unhealthy thing to do. So the idea of social class existed, but it wasn't conceived of in the same way that we do now, as something fluid. It's something that can be used to explain the people's lives, what Weber called their life chances, which I would define as the odds of getting what you want out of life in the Giddens, Denier et al. Text they define it as basically in terms of material success, becoming economically prosperous. I think that's, that's a little narrower than I would put it, but it fits the materialistic capitalist society that we live in, of course. Okay, in this period, in the Middle Ages in Europe, there were generally three orders, they were called, which could have been considered three classes. They were those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Those who pray were people associated with the church, and by church in the Middle Ages, I mean the Roman Catholic Church. That was the primary Christian grouping. Denomination didn't mean much then. If you weren't a member of the Roman Catholic Church and accepting that, the catechism of the church, you were a heretic, basically. So there weren't recognized denominations in Christianity. There was the true church and the heretics. Those who pray associated with the church, monks, priests, bishops, those sorts of folks, they had a lot of political power in the Middle Ages. Then those who fight, those were the knights, the lords, the people who had perhaps in some cases led the barbarian so-called bands that had a role in ending the Roman Empire. They definitely had military skills, and their power was based on two things: their military skill, their ability to command followers in some sort of a military detachment, which allowed them to gain control of land. Now they controlled so much land, they could grant it as a fief of some sort to one of their subordinates in this military clan. And that would establish a relationship of vassalage and lordship between the two people. That the higher status person who granted the land would become the lord, the liege lord of the person who received the land, the vassal. There would be a ceremony of homage where they would embrace and kiss each other and exchange their vows to always to take care of one another. The vassal would come when called to military service to fight the Lord's battles, and the Lord would pull the clan together to fight for the interests of the vassals if needed. Now the vassals, the military vassals, often got enough land that they could make similar arrangements with people who would farm it, who would grow food for them. These tended to be the peasants. These were those who work, which was most people in medieval society. So you have these three groupings, okay, which are similar to classes, but they weren't considered something which was permeable. Nobody moved up or down particularly in theory. It happened in practice, but not in theory. The modern view of social class as a category of people that share a similar economic position came into Western canon with Karl Marx. No one before that had considered social class as something which could be used to explain the ebb and flow of history, as he did. This was an innovation. He was the first to do that. That's one reason why anyone who's studying sociology at the graduate level or wants to be a professional sociologist has to come to terms with Marx in some way or another and spend a lot of time reading his work. You have to have an opinion about it. You don't have to accept, and most sociologists just accept some of his ideas and not others, for instance. You don't have to just swallow it whole. You can criticize it, modify it, adapt it to your particular circumstances. Marx is, well, I'll get to that later if need be. But back to, these definitions tend to be somewhat boring and repetitive, but stratification system. You may remember I talked about the origin, the genesis of that term in the social context. Stratification came from geology, where you have rock layers, one layered on top of another. You can also view that as a hierarchy, or an ordering by some variable, a value of some variable, rank of some sort, income, whatever it may be, a hierarchy. So with something at the top, think of a pyramid, for instance, that fits well with income. There's only a few people that are at the top income levels and a lot more that are down further below at the base. So there's some characteristics of all these stratification systems that we're going to talk about, which includes caste systems, for instance, and systems you would find in a slave society. Um, People are ranked, categories are assigned that rank people with common characteristics. They're grouped into categories. And you may remember me talking about Zygmunt Bauman's ideas in thinking sociologically that a important aspect of human social behavior involves drawing boundaries, understanding where you are, us and them, for instance. This doesn't always mean, it doesn't always have a negative connotation. People tend to think in categories. It's time consuming to evaluate each individual you encounter on an individual basis. In a crowd, for instance, people take shortcuts, and some of these are stereotypes. Nevertheless, we all tend to do it to a certain extent. And this kind of boundary formation you find in many exhibited in many social processes. So boundaries between classes, although permeable to a greater or lesser extent, depending upon the time period and the society, are created by human beings. Usually they're created and managed by people with more power. And the system works to the advantage of those who have more power, income, resources of some sort. Those who are not in the dominant group in this system tend to have less access to the resources that those who are in the dominant group do. Okay, another feature of stratification systems, your life experiences depend upon your class, the ranking, the category you find yourself in. At birth, for a while, you can move up in many cases and move from what's called an ascribed status based upon biological characteristics and your family's economic conditions at birth to obtaining some achieved status, which puts you in a higher class category, although basically most people don't move far, if at all, from the class into which they were born. I'll give you some numbers on that a bit later. So, and one other aspect of these stratification systems is these ranks, these categories, their arrangement. They change very slowly, very slowly. So, past societies tended to have early hunting and gathering societies didn't really have a caste system, a class system at all. Everyone was more or less in the same situation. There might have been some gender hierarchy, but it wasn't necessarily something which disadvantaged women. Men tended to be involved in hunting the game. That was primarily because women they were the primary caregivers for the children. They had to nurse the children, and that's one reason that it's generally believed that women invented agriculture. They were staying around the camp, temporary or more permanent, and observing things and preparing food with seeds, grinding seeds, and probably noticed some spilled seeds sprouted. And we went from there. Now, to take a little detour, typically when you read about the long view of social change or hear about it, the period which we began to engage in large-scale agriculture and live in towns, that's considered a great leap forward. This was an important thing. The reality may be, and James Scott in a book that called Against the Grain, I will pull up that image here for you. I thought I would. There we go. I have to share my screen though. Just one moment. Not that you need to see it, but I need to get this in here. All right. I'm about to switch to showing you PowerPoints and such, so bear with me. All right, Against the Grain is an anthropologist who studied some agricultural societies in Southeast Asia for a long time. And his view is that people did not really willingly give up the hunting and gathering lifestyle to live in towns and work in fields all day long. Their diet was better when they were hunting and gathering, it was more varied. Um, Marshall Solins, another anthropologist, wrote a book called Stone Age Economics that said that in the in the old Paleolithic era, the so-called Stone Age, and somewhat later, of course, any time before the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution of about 6000 BC, when large-scale farming became common in some parts of the world, they were able to satisfy all of their needs with about 6 hours of activity every day. So they had a lot more leisure for whatever, they needed to, wanted to do with it, to tell stories, to try to explain the universe and their part in it by spinning mythical tales and whatever it might be, maybe just sleeping, maybe enjoying just being alive. Um, there were challenges definitely, but as far as staying alive in most cases, if you avoided disease, you didn't have to do a lot to get it done. Now, after the Neolithic Revolution, you began to see societies develop that had a high degree of inequality. And the people who worked the land were, in many cases, actually in bondage, slaves, or might as well have been. And they were ruled by a small elite, typically priests, rulers who controlled an army. Um, And Scott thinks that people had to be forced into this. Many of them were probably captured in military campaigns designed to capture slaves to work the fields. Uh, I won't belabor that, but he makes a good point. It does go against the grain of the dominant narrative of human history. So, going back, I'm going to stop. Okay, so basically stratification involves putting people into categories that have unequal access or differential access to scarce resources. Income, it could be something material or it could be symbolic. It could be the right to vote, for instance, or the right to an education. Uh, that wasn't really obviously that relevant a resource in ancient society in Mesopotamia and Egypt, or in the Middle Ages, particularly European Middle Ages. By Middle Ages, if you don't know what I'm talking about there, it's basically the period from the end of the Roman Empire's domination of Europe and most of the Middle East and parts of Africa around the year 500 to 700 AD, I'm going to call it, but typically scholars call it CE, the Common Era, because AD, Anno Domini, year of our Lord. It's been recognized not everyone in the world is Christian. So before Christ and in the year of our Lord is can be considered some sort of cultural imperialism, and so the terminology now is the Common Era, same scale, the year zero to the present is the Common Era. Before that, and there was no year zero, by the way, it started the year one. Sorry about that. Before the year one, BCE, before the Common Era. So Roman Empire ended. It's debatable from anytime 470 CE to 700 CE. Some people talk about late antiquity that was really an extension of Roman practices for a while. Rome didn't really fall. It kind of faded away, was absorbed into other social formations. In Europe, anyway. So, the Middle Ages, beginning around 700 to maybe 1300 CE, 1300 to 1400. In other words, the 14th to the 15th century. Some would stretch it 16th century. You're talking early modern era. These eras are somewhat arbitrary. There are significant events that divide them, like the fall of the Roman Empire and the Hundred Years' War between France and Britain in the case of the end of the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, at this point, I think I'm going to put the PowerPoint slides up. This is from my usual lecture that I would do in a face-to-face class, but I'll be adding some others as we go along. So I usually decorate the beginning of the lecture, the title page, with some informative, relevant slides. So here we have contrasting wealth and poverty, and I believe that's a city in South America. I am not certain. Bill Gates' house, one of the 0.01% that have a lot more resources than the rest, or access to them. A couple of the original 0.01% here, Nelson Rockefeller, and I don't know who the other one is. Homeless person, people working in a sweatshop in Asia. And this is a demonstration by a nurses union that they were working to implement, to get interest in among politicians, implementing a financial transactions tax, also called a Tobin tax. That would be a tax on the sale and purchase of stocks and bonds and those things that form most of the wealth of the truly wealthy, equities and bonds. It didn't really go anywhere. However, it was the one concrete demand, which found its way out of something called the Occupy movement, which you may have heard of. It sprung up in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. They highlighted the high degree of inequality in American and world society. They came up with the slogan, "We are the 99%." Actually, it was an anthropologist, David Graeber, who I may get to also, who contributed that. So if you've heard that term, the 99%, that is, what that refers to. The 99% of people making below a certain income or having less than a certain amount of wealth. So they didn't precisely define that. We will get to some of those kinds of numeric divisions shortly. So stratification, some definitions here. There are different ways to define these rankings. Now, Marx used a relational definition, means it was based upon your relation to what he called the means of production, the factories, the mines, and so forth. So if you own the means of production, you were one class. If you did not own them and you had to sell your labor power to them, you were a different one. In Marx's scheme, the upper class was known as the bourgeoisie, the lower class, the proletariat. These are Latin, well, they're French and Latin, basically, respectively. But what's more commonly used by American sociologists and British sociologists in particular, by anyone who's really not a Marxist or Marxist, neo-Marxist, or having Marxist preferences, is a gradational approach where you divide the population up based upon income or overall net worth or something along those lines. That's called a gradational scheme. So, as I mentioned, Marx was the first to try to explain social structure, social change, and really the broad sweep of history in terms of class conflict, using the concept of class in historical explanation. And Marx he was a follower of he was heavily influenced by the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a German philosopher, very difficult to understand and read. I don't advise it unless you're really into impenetrable prose. Um, Hegel basically identified the master trend of history, and it didn't have anything to do with classes. Marx modified Hegel's views to include classes. Marx viewed that history as being driven by class conflict. One class with the power and resources conflicts with another class, and something new, a new social formation, comes out of the result of their conflict. So, and he explained the end of the Roman Empire that way, the transition from feudalism to capitalism in the same manner. He thought these transitions were determined by the nature of the what he called the mode of production, the way the mode of production was the means of production plus the relations of production. Relations of production is basically the class system. So these two things determine the mode of production. And his view was, as technology changed, new things were invented, it became possible, the relations of production, the class system that people were kept immobile in, it hindered the development of the means of production because the older technology was held on too tightly. The newer technology, newer way of organizing things couldn't really get going unless there was a big change. So in the case of feudalism and capitalism, that transition, the feudal system of the Middle Ages, where as I mentioned, most people were peasants of some sort of work the land only. Many of them were serfs. They were bound to the land, meaning they could not leave, even if someone opened a factory of some sort in a nearby city, because cities tended to be free of the feudal power structure for the most part, some cities. They could not leave. If they tried to go, they could be captured and brought back and tried in the court, which was run by the person who who owned the land on which they lived. If that person gave the land to some other vassal, or if it was retaken by the liege lord, the serfs would go along with it. This system of serfdom continued in Russia until about 1866, I believe. So anyway, because serfs could not leave the land and peasants were more or less stuck as well, you couldn't get workers to work in the factories that were being organized along incipient capitalist lines. So something had to give, and what gave was the feudal order, and capitalism emerged as a result of the conflict of various sorts. The English Civil War is one, but it was spread over quite some time. The French Revolution was the last European large-scale manifestation of that transition. That was 1789, so it happened earlier in England, which is where capitalism really took root first. That's partly because in England had a lot of coal, a lot of iron. They had developed a more efficient agricultural system. They learned a lot more about fertilizer and crop rotation, more sophisticated crop rotation. So they didn't need to have as many people working the land to produce food as you did, for instance, in France or Germany or Eastern Europe. So that's a lot of time on that one slide. Moving on. Max Weber, you've probably read about him. I know I've talked about him several times. He developed a theory of stratification that was much more sophisticated than Marx's, which was basically based on economics. Weber had a multidimensional system. Your life, what he called your life chances, the odds of getting what you want, typically economic prosperity, was dependent upon your position in these three dimensions of class, status, and party, is what he called it. Class was similar to Marx's idea, although he had more divisions, like the pariah classes, people who were negatively disadvantaged in some way. They were outcasts. Think of the Dalits, the untouchables in the Indian caste system, for instance. For Weber, class is a shared situation. Status is a ranking based upon your lifestyle and education and religion and that sort of thing, cultural associations. What he called party was more or less your political associations. How much power do you have to control your own life, to control the activities of others? What was later called status crystallization by Gerhard Linsky is the concept that people who rank high on the economic division also seem to rank high on the other two, on status and party. And also people tend to group together with others who have similar rankings in these three orders. So regarding status, cultural factors. Pierre Bourdieu, French anthropologist, wrote a very influential book, which you might see here. I'm not sure, probably not. Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste in art and music and photography and so forth. It's a thick book. I have not read all of it, but his idea is, and it seems to be legitimate, is that, am I still sharing the screen? I have no idea. No. There we go, back to that. Bourdieu advanced concepts of different kinds of capital. Now, capital often just means money or some kind of economic resource. But Bourdieu said there are other kinds. There's cultural capital. There's symbolic capital as well. Cultural capital is your knowledge of things like art, music, etc., your taste, what you like. It varies with social class, and it ends up being a class marker. If you go to a job interview and you recognize a piece of abstract art on the prospective boss's wall and say something about it and talk like you know something about it, whoever's interviewing you may, if that is their art and they understand it and like it, they may identify you as one of them, so to speak, like someone who might belong in their company, in physical company. So they become class markers. And why are they class markers? Well, things like abstract art, for instance, it's not obvious how to interpret a lot of this stuff. You have to learn that. If you're from a family where your parents can take time off work or maybe don't work and can take you to museums and can afford to give you ballet lessons and violin lessons and all these things, you're going to learn about a wider range of cultural activities, cultural productions, than someone whose parents have no time at all for anything like that. You're not born with partialities to certain kinds of art or music or so forth, reading material. You learn it in the household and you pick that up. You pick up certain things from your parents. Well, many things you pick up from your parents. That really was a pretty banal statement on my part. I apologize. But these cultural tastes are integral in reproducing the class system in Western society and others as well. So if you read a book called, I'm going to pause this here because find the book. Okay. This book, Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, as the cover says, it was a New York Times bestseller. That is true. It's a good book. It describes how this cultural capital and class reproduction kind of work in many ways in this person's experience. That J.D. Vance, he's conservative, so he's not really this. I guess I don't know if that gives him more credibility when he's writing about social class and the barriers that people from lower classes face in advancing in American society. So, Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis. He grew up in Appalachia, basically, the edge of Appalachia in Kentucky and Ohio, kind of on the border with near West Virginia, very poor area of the United States. His mother had a substance abuse problem. His father had left long ago and I believe was dead. Mostly he was raised by his grandmother. And they had to move frequently because when he was with his mother, definitely they would move a lot because people would show up to evict him. Well, he did well in high school against the odds and got a scholarship to Ohio State University and did well there. And although he was sure he wouldn't get in, he was encouraged to apply to Yale Law School, and he was accepted and given a scholarship and a full ride. Now he describes how at the end of your first year of law school at a place like Yale or Harvard or Princeton Law School, representatives of the big law firms in the East Coast in DC, Boston, New York will come into town to interview students who they may want to extend job offers to kind of, lay claim to them before anyone else does. So they will take a lot of people to dinner quite often. And he realized pretty quickly that he knew that he was being observed to see if he knew which fork or which spoon to use with which dish. His girlfriend was from an affluent background and had given him some coaching before he went, but a couple times he had to step outside and call her on the phone to find out what he should do because he didn't want to appear to be clueless about this because he knew he was being judged by his table manners, his accent, his choice of wine, all these things. When he was asked what sort of wine he would like, he said, well, I have white wine. He said, well, would you like Chardonnay or Riesling or Chablis? And he didn't know what those were. He did not know how to choose. So these are the types of things that you learn if you've grown up in an upper class family in the United States, or if you just like wine, regardless of your class. And it can make the difference between getting a job offer or not in many cases. So symbolic capital, that is another related concept. That if you have symbolic capital, that means people believe that your position in society, the stuff you have, is legitimate. You deserve it for some reason. All right, going back to my sharing the screen. Eventually I'll learn every bit of this. We'll have to take some. All right. So, cultural capital and symbolic capital. Economic inequality, as I mentioned, it was a hot topic for a while. It was in the 2012 election and in the 2016 election, not quite so much. As a result of the economic impact of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, it's surely going to come back into a prominent place in the national discussions and concerns. What has happened over time in the United States and many other countries, especially the developed countries, is that those who are at the upper end of the income and net worth scale have seen their incomes increase, their wealth increase, at a much higher rate than those below them. And wealth is becoming more concentrated in the upper reaches. An advisor I had in undergraduate school said that the mark of an open class system is not whether or not somebody can move up, but whether or not somebody that's moved way up ever falls out, or whether they just, are perched there forever. And in general, there's not that much movement out of the upper reaches of the wealth hierarchy. So a couple of examples here. In 1979, top 1% earned 9% of all income. In 2007, 23.5% of all income. That's almost 3 times as much. The average ratio of the salary. And one number you see a lot is the ratio of the CEO of a corporation to the average salary of the people that work for that corporation. An example here, in 83, it was 46-1, meaning the CEO, the top boss, made 46 times the salary of an average worker, or average salary of all the workers in 83. In 2013, which is 30 years later, it gone up to 331-1, 9 times higher. Apple CEO in 2011, 6,000 times higher. I'll have to grab this now. I do not have it. Elon Musk now, the owner chief of Tesla and SpaceX, he now makes 41,000 times the average salary of people who work for him. So that's far above Apple. Okay. I think I'll show this to give myself a break and make sure this works.
We are the 99%. It's the rallying cry of the Occupy Wall Street protesters. They say that a tiny majority controls America's wealth. So, how rich have the richest got? And how poor are the rest of us? Is it really 99% versus 1%? The richest 1% of the U.S. population, they own a third of U.S. net worth. So how did we get here? When times were good, everyone gained. In Bill Clinton's boom of 1993 to 2000, average incomes went up, just as they did during George W. Bush's boom at the beginning of his presidency. But if you were rich, you gained even more. That's nearly half of all the growth in Clinton boom years. Under George W. Bush, it was even more. And there are some really rich people in the U.S. today. In fact, there are now over 3.1 million millionaires. But these are not the richest of all. The U.S. has over 400 billionaires, more than any other country in the world. Who's at the top of that pile? These three have a combined net worth of $131 billion. That's just over the combined budget shortfall of every state in the U.S. for 2011. More than the cost of the global war on terror in 2010. But haven't the rich lost out as well as the poor in the economic crash? When the economy tanked, everyone suffered. In 2010, the average American earned $26,487, down over $2,000 in real terms on 2006. If you were poor, it's been an even bigger drop. The 24 million least wealthy households in America saw their average income go down by 10%. If you were super rich, it went down too. The 400 wealthiest American households lost around 4%, including inflation. That's down to an average of $270.5 million per household. So the richest lost 4%. The poorest lost 10%. Part of the reason average Americans have been hit so hard is where their wealth comes from. Before the crash, middle-class Americans had 65% of their wealth tied up in their house. But the richest 1% of the population kept most of their wealth in stocks and shares and business. So, when house prices went south, many Americans found their wealth disappearing too. Now, 1 in every 7 Americans lives below the poverty line. That's a record 46.2 million people. 1 in 6 Americans have no health insurance. That's 50 million people. Of every 17 Americans, at least one will be earning below the minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. 14.5% of American households are defined as food insecure. That means for every 7 households, one will have trouble putting enough food on the table. But some things are doing very well. Sales of luxury cars are up. Big luxury brands have reported their best sales figures in years. Tiffany Jewelers up. Brands like Louis Vuitton and Givenchy, brands like Gucci, Yves Saint Laurent, and Porsche. And America's top executives are paying themselves very well too. It is down, but still pretty good. $4.9 million each in the latest figures. And the Washington Post investigation found the following. Since the 1970s, median pay for executives at the nation's largest companies has more than quadrupled, even after adjusting for inflation, according to researchers. Over the same period, pay for a typical non-supervisory worker has dropped more than 10%. But don't the super rich pay taxes? They do, just not quite so much as the rest of us. If you earn between $100,000 and $200,000, you will be paying up to 25% effective tax rate, and that's before payroll taxes kick in. The 400 richest tax returns surveyed by the IRS paid just 18.1% in 2008, and it's got better for them. In 2001, as George W. Bush became president, that rate was 23%. So is it 99% versus 1%? The richest 1% of the US population own a third of US net worth. But an even smaller group, the 0.01% of the population, are at a record high. In fact, is it really 99.99% versus 0.01%? So where do you fit? Are you one of the 99.99% or one of the 0.01%?
Okay. That was a little dated, but the picture hasn't, the trend has continued, and it's undoubtedly going to accelerate. And inequality and the class system may begin to take on more of the features of a caste system in many ways. There's already some class conflict kind of bubbling up in France between the people who are on the front lines, who have to continue to work to provide essential services, working in groceries, providing police services, medical services, of course, during the pandemic, and what they believe is like an elite that has escaped to their country homes and working remotely, a teleworking elite. And I hear a lot of people breathlessly saying, oh, well, now we're finally moving into remote work. We're going to become accustomed to it. We don't have to live where the job is anymore. We can live wherever it's prettiest or healthiest or cheapest or whatever. But still, many people are not going to be able to do that. They're going to be on the front lines physically having to serve others. And I can see a division, along those lines, and some resentments of the sort which have been politically useful, politically salient in the past, shifting the political dynamic in the United States. But we'll just have to see what happens. Okay, Thomas Piketty caused quite a stir with a book called Capital in the 21st Century, published in 2014. You may not have heard of it, but it was definitely on the minds of many of the talking heads, the editorial writers of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times. For several weeks, there were dueling commentaries on the value of his ideas, and it's basically about the rise of inequality and the things that drove it. Okay, so it's data heavy. It's not only data heavy. So let me stop the share for a moment. It's just plain heavy. You see, that's I think only 660 pages. I say only because I've just started read about a half of his new book, and it's over 1,000 pages, not counting the notes at the end. So I'm surprised I didn't read all of this yet. I eventually will, perhaps. Amazon, if you buy a book on a Kindle and you highlight things, Amazon stores those highlights. So they can tell how much of a book you've read. And they compiled all that they have those statistics on hand for a lot of books. They can use it for marketing. They determined this book was their least read bestseller ever. Most people stopped reading about page 15, or at least stopped making notes. I made it a little further than that, but I'm still embarrassed that my flag stopped so soon. So anyway, so what does Piketty have to say about inequality? Well, he's a French economist. He used a lot of French tax records, inheritance records going well before the First World War to chart the ebb and flow of wealth, really, because that's who was easiest to track, the wealthy, because inheritance records didn't mean much if nobody had anything to leave to anyone else, any property or anything. A lot of people, the poorer people, did not even show up in a lot of the records. So his explanation for the rise in inequality has to do with economic growth and the returns which people get from investments, owning land, owning stock, that sort of thing, having money to loan. People have made money by loaning money at interest since time immemorial. That's been pretty steady. Economic growth has risen and fallen. Mostly it's stayed the same through most of human history. Until 150 years ago, most people did not, the vast majority of people did not live far beyond the subsistence level. And it had been that way for 4,000 years. So what changed that? What was the Industrial Revolution, among other things? Political revolutions were part of that as well. People obtained the right to vote and were able to advocate for themselves and their class in many cases, and in the electoral sector, in politics, gain power, elect their own people. So anyway, so what he says is the returns that you get from having money to having investments, or having, in other words, being able to invest, buying stock or bonds or something like that, the returns have stayed fairly steady, and they've actually grown faster than the economy. And the rate of growth of salaries, of what people are paid, of income, is tied to the growth of the economy. So that has not kept pace with the returns you get from simply owning capital, owning equity and bonds and that sort of thing, or factories and so forth. So gradually there was this divergence between those who owned these types of assets and those who worked for a living. And the bulk of the net worth that exists in the United States and the world really is in the form of equities and bonds and stocks, that sort of thing. And it's held for the most part by the top 1% of households. the statistics, it's not that important to remember really, and they change. In fact, I will give you some in a moment, but it's not important that you remember them necessarily, with one exception, and I'll get to that a little later. So I have a chart here. Here's Piketty's income chart of the Great U-turn. Before the stock market crash in 1929, inequality was higher than it had been at any time before in the United States history. It was highest in Europe right before the First World War. First World War shook things up quite a bit. You can see a drop here. This is United States only now, so there was a greater effect in Europe. We'll see that in a moment. So, but still, you have here at the end of the First World War a sort of an economic downturn in the fortunes of the highest 1% of earners. This chart is the share of all income that the top 1% get. So in 1928, it was almost a quarter. So 1% getting 25% of the income. And then we have the stock market crash going into the Great Depression. And then the Second World War begins. I've not been sharing my screen. There we go. Okay, this graph. See, here we are in the Second World War, and suddenly the top 1%, they're only getting a measly 10% of all the income. What has happened? Well, I'll tell you in a moment, but look at 1978, begins to go up again. So it's almost back to where it was at the peak. I think it's beyond that now. This is 2012. I know it's beyond that, but it's probably beyond this earlier peak. In the Second World War, a lot of production was organized to produce things for the war effort, the war against Japan, Germany, Italy, and it was very important after that in the Cold War that the American economy continued to produce a lot of stuff. Now, they were producing a lot more stuff after the end of the Second World War because they were almost the only game in the world. The German, English, French, Japanese industrial capacity had been destroyed in the war. We instituted the Marshall Plan and basically loaned money to European nations. It was offered to the Soviet Union, they declined. Loan money to them so they could buy the products of our factories, and our factories were booming. This is sometimes called the golden age of American capitalism here, from 1945 to 78, roughly. One reason that the working class basically had a greater share of the national income and a greater share of the increase in output due to increased productivity was due to the strength of labor unions. And part of that strength was in their ability to call a strike. And so they were able to, at one point, there was a meeting of Walter Reuther and who was the head of the United Auto Workers, and Engine Charlie Wilson, the head of General Motors, and they made an agreement where the unions agreed not to go on strike, not to call strikes just any old time, in exchange for contracts that had guaranteed wage increases. So the increases in wages, which means increasing, when productivity was increasing, so there was a bigger pie to be split up, so workers were getting the same slice of that pie, so to speak, for this period when these contracts were in effect. It was important that there not be any strikes to interrupt production because Second World War had ended. We were in the Cold War with the Soviet Union and China as well. Later, a hot war with clients of Soviet Union and or China, 53 in Korea, 65 to 74 in Vietnam. So what happened in this period? It was possible to get, with a high school education, to get a job in a factory in your hometown and make enough money to buy a house, raise a family, have a stay-at-home spouse, buy a new car every few years, buy a boat, go on vacations with a high school education, because wages were relatively high if you belonged to a union and worked in a unionized factory. In 78, it was a recession and oil crisis and increased inflation as well as unemployment. There was an active movement to break the power of the unions, which was begun by many corporations, and think tanks promoted this. Consultants went around teaching corporate leaders how to break the unions. You want the opening salvo of that, the most notorious case was when the air traffic controllers went on strike, and it shut down air traffic for a while. Ronald Reagan fired all of them. These were federal employees, so he could do that. Fired them all. And that, of course, destroyed their union. They were out. So you began to see right-to-work laws enacted in many states, Texas, for instance. In many states in the North and the industrial Midwest, if you got a job at a particular factory, you had to join a union. It was called a closed shop. Only union members could work there. Right-to-work laws prohibit those arrangements. Being a member of the union is optional. More recently, they have eliminated, at least in Texas and some other southern states, it used to be the case your union dues could be deducted. You do pay dues to belong to the union. You get something in return, at least you used to. So you paid, money was taken out of your check by the payroll department where you worked and went to the union, and often they would use that for political activism. Sometimes it would be used for shady purposes, like the Teamsters Union financing the construction of casinos in Las Vegas operated by organized crime, loaning money to the dishonest elements to expand casinos and so forth. You may have heard that story. I don't know. So there were abuses, of course, but once she began chipping away at the union, it didn't take long for wage increases by for the workers to begin to slow almost to a stop. Okay, here we have after-tax income in the United States. This came from inequality.org. These are generally what are known as quintiles. They're dividing up the population for the households, actually, by 5. Quintuplets, 5, for instance. I can't ever pronounce quinceañera, the 15-year-old coming out in the Latino community. So the bottom 20% of households, what that means is from an income of 0 up until the point where 20% of the people make below that number, 20% of households rather, that's the first 20% or the first quintile. These wages, or income rather, it's adjusted for inflation. And you can see the bottom 20%, it's been pretty much flat. The same, you don't see much change until you get up to this one, which is the top 20%. And then if you look at the top 1%, they have gone from in 79 after-tax income adjusted for inflation, so these are standardized, about 750,000 to like 1.7 million. That's a significant increase. The top 20% as a whole, so maybe 400,000 to 650, 700,000. But for the rest of us, not so much increase. Here's a similar chart. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. This is the percentage of growth in income, not the actual income, how much it's grown. Here you see the top 1%, almost 270, 280% from 1979 to 2000, to the recession of 2008. So that's a little dated. Okay, as I said, here's a summary of Piketty's ideas. Returns for investment increase faster than wages for work. And deindustrialization. This is the hollowing out of the American industrial sector, the export of jobs to Europe and Japan, because they finally got around to building new factories. They were making their own steel, their own automobiles, and so forth. They weren't buying from us necessarily. They also built newer factories. They might have more advanced technology. They might have some advantages in that realm. Of course, there were political issues, trade agreements that maybe didn't always favor the United States. Technological change. This is a commonly ascribed cause of inequality. People have not been getting have not been trained in the skills and knowledge that is in demand. Technology changes, and the people who understand that technology become employed. Others have more trouble. So, and typically a lot of new technologies pay quite a bit better than service industry jobs, retail and food service and so forth. Political factors as well. I mentioned the union busting policies. Also, the minimum wage was not increased for quite a period of time. It became worth less and less with the passage of time as inflation ate away at its value. There were repeated tax cuts which favored, for instance, long-term capital gains, the money you make by buying and selling stock and other big assets was taxed at a more favorable level. Income taxes were, the top tax on income was 80-some% in the United States. Remember this, it's a progressive tax, it's a marginal tax, meaning the 80, I think it was 85% only kicked in at a very high level. The level just below that was taxed at a lower rate. And, if you don't know how progressive taxes work, you pay 1% up to a certain point, and then you pay a higher percentage on whatever you make over that, and you may get to another threshold and be in a new tax bracket and a higher rate still. So, and what's interesting is during this period, the golden age of American capitalism, productivity high, everybody doing great, economic growth was high, was fairly rapid. We had these very high tax rates, so it did not inhibit American economic growth. There have been a lot of cuts to federal benefits. Bill Clinton ending, quote, welfare as we know it with the reforms they passed in the 1990s. So-called welfare benefits are not nearly as, they were never terribly generous, but they're even less so now. Most members of what are called the working poor, people who have to work for a living but are just barely getting by, they make too much money for public assistance. So also the winner-take-all effect. Incomes for top CEOs and superstars and so forth in sports and entertainment, they have gone way up. The CEOs have kind of been able to write their own deal in many ways. Their incomes have gone up even when the companies have done poorly, as we saw in the financial crisis banks rewarding their employees with big bonuses after they crashed the economy. Not all of them. That's an overgeneralization. So, okay, I think let me call this part one and stop this. I don't know how big a file I'll be able to stuff into Canvas, so this is a good time to stop. Part two will be posted later.